Flight attendant slapped black mom holding baby, didn't know her husband owned the airline. What if the one place you thought offered safety and dignity became the stage for your deepest humiliation? A crowded airplane cabin, hundreds of eyes, a mother clutching her baby. A moment meant to be ordinary, suddenly stained with something no one expected. This story begins on a bright morning that promised nothing but peace. Jasmine Carter, 32 years old, pediatrician, healer of children, walked through her home with her 6-month-old daughter, Zara, balanced gently on her hip. Her daughter's gummy grin had been the sunlight of her mornings for half a year now, and today should have been no different. Their bags were packed, passports ready. A short flight was all that stood between them and a long-awaited family holiday. But Jasmine's calm steps concealed a heart heavy with unease. She knew the world had a way of questioning women who looked like her, especially when stepping into spaces stamped with luxury and privilege. She tried to push the thought away as she folded a pastel blanket into Zara's bag, humming to soothe both mother and child. In the doorway, Malcolm Carter adjusted the cuffs of his charcoal suit jacket, the kind that fit him like it had been made for his shoulders alone. At 35, he had risen higher than many men twice his age. His name whispered in boardrooms. His signature signed partnerships that moved billions. But almost no one outside the inner circle of his company knew one truth. Malcolm Carter owned the very airline they were about to board. That detail he kept close, as if protecting it, gave him the vantage point to see the cracks. Rumors had reached him, stories of passengers who looked like him, and like Jasmine, treated with indifference or worse. He needed to see with his own eyes what kind of skies his airline offered its travelers. So the private jet remained grounded, and the Carter family, with first-class tickets in hand, would fly like any other customer. Before we continue, let me ask something of you. If you've ever seen unfairness while traveling, pause a moment, subscribe to this channel so stories like this can keep being told, and let me know in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from right now? At the airport, the signs of strain showed earlier than expected. The agent at the counter smiled wide at the couple in front of Jasmine, then froze when the Carters stepped forward. Her hand hesitated on the scanner. Her eyes shifted quickly between the boarding passes and their faces, as if the golden letters spelling first class couldn't possibly belong to them. First class? She repeated, voice tight, eyebrows arched high. Yes, Malcolm answered evenly, his baritone carrying no edge, only fact. For the three of us. The woman's lips pressed together. Her fingers moved with unnecessary slowness across the keyboard. She held the tickets longer than needed, sliding them back with the faintest curl of disbelief in her expression. And the infant, she added, as though Zara were an inconvenience rather than a tiny human. That's generally how families work. Malcolm replied with a small, dry smile. We tend to stay together. Jasmine's grip on Zara tightened. She knew this script. She had lived versions of it her entire life. People surprised by her presence, surprised by her place. But this was supposed to be a joyful trip, a milestone. Their daughter's first flight. She tucked the sting away and pressed forward, whispering into Zara's curls. We'll be fine, sunshine. Just a little longer. The family moved on through security, where yet again, Jasmine was pulled aside. Random, the agent said. Random. She handed over her baby's formula, her diaper bag, even the pacifier. She watched white passengers breeze by without a pause. Malcolm met her eyes from across the barrier, the corners of his mouth pulling downward in silent recognition. They regrouped at the gate, both wearing the same calm mask. It was a look learned from years of proving themselves twice over. And as they waited, Jasmine rocked Zara against her shoulder, unaware of the eyes that had already found them. Sharp, appraising eyes belonging to a woman in a pressed uniform, her hair gleaming under the fluorescent glare of the airport terminal. A name tag glimmered on her chest, Karen Sutton. Her smile was tight, her glance fleeting, but the way she lingered on Jasmine's baby, the way she scanned Malcolm up and down, carried an energy Jasmine couldn't shake. She buried the unease deep, kissed Zara's forehead, and told herself the journey ahead would wash it all away. She could not have been more wrong. Because once the Carters stepped onto that plane, kindness would evaporate like mist. And hours later, when the flight leveled high above the clouds, the world would watch in silence as a line was crossed. A line no airline employee should ever cross, and a line that would bring an empire crashing down on its own staff. The Carter family's flight had only just begun, and so had the nightmare. The check-in counter was supposed to be routine, a scan of tickets, a polite smile, and a wish for a pleasant flight. But when the Carters stepped forward with their first-class passes, the air shifted. The attendant on duty, a young woman with hair pinned neatly beneath her airline scarf, glanced at the boarding passes, then at Jasmine and Malcolm. Her lips parted slightly, as though she were trying to reconcile the paper in her hand with the family standing in front of her. "First class?" she repeated, her tone holding the weight of disbelief. "Yes," Malcolm replied, voice even but firm, a man used to questions layered beneath politeness. He leaned slightly on the counter, his expression calm, but his eyes carried the quiet fire of someone who had answered this same unspoken accusation too many times. The attendant hesitated, her fingers hovering above the keyboard, then began typing with exaggerated care, each keystroke slower than the last. She asked again about the infant, as though Zara's presence in their row required extra justification. Jasmine shifted the baby against her chest, her lips pressed together, choosing silence over the temptation to defend the obvious. When the boarding passes finally slid back across the counter, the attendant forced a smile that never reached her eyes. "Enjoy your flight," she said, the words carrying no warmth. Jasmine turned without replying, letting her silence hold the weight of her dignity. Yet inside, a knot had already formed. She knew this wasn't the last time today her family's place in the cabin would be challenged. At security, the knot pulled tighter. Shoes off, laptops out, liquids displayed. Jasmine moved swiftly, having traveled enough to know the rhythm. But just as she gathered her tray, an agent gestured her aside. "Ma'am, you've been selected for additional screening." Her brows pinched. "Randomly?" she asked. The agent avoided her eyes, repeating the script drilled into his voice. "Yes, random." But Jasmine's eyes flicked to the elderly white couple behind her who were ushered straight through, to the businessman with polished shoes who wasn't stopped, to the mother with a stroller who was waved on without pause. Her stomach sank. It's never random when it always happens to the same kind of people. Zara fussed as her formula was opened and tested, as her diaper bag was pulled apart, as Jasmine was patted down with latex gloves. Malcolm stood on the other side of the barrier, watching, his jaw tight but his body language still controlled. They had lived this performance before. The trick was not letting it strip away their composure. When Jasmine was finally released, she kissed Zara's cheek, more for herself than for the child, grounding herself in the innocence of her daughter's smile. By the time they reached the gate, both parents wore their masks of composure again. They waited in the roped-off area for priority boarding, Zara cooing softly in her carrier. That was when Jasmine noticed her. The flight attendant standing by the gate, posture rigid, eyes sharp and assessing. Her uniform was impeccable, navy pressed without a crease, her blonde hair gleamed, coiled into a perfect bun. The name tag caught the light. Karen Sutton. At first, Karen's smile seemed professional, the kind plastered on for passengers. But as her eyes moved over the Carters, the smile thinned into something different. Jasmine felt it in her chest, the weight of being studied, of being measured and quietly disapproved of. "Boarding now for first class," the gate agent announced. Malcolm rose, steadying Zara's bag on his shoulder. Jasmine adjusted her daughter and followed. But when they approached, Karen shifted her attention past them, greeting the white couple behind them instead, her tone suddenly warmer. "Excuse me?" Malcolm said, extending their passes. "We're in first class." Karen took the tickets without eye contact, her lips set in a line. "Right this way," she muttered, gesturing without the courtesy of assisting with their bags. Jasmine caught her offering help moments earlier to another family, her touch light and voice bright. The Carters walked the jet bridge in silence, the sounds of other passengers' chatter bouncing around them. Jasmine could feel her chest tightening, the subtle cuts already leaving marks. Inside the cabin, the pattern only deepened. The Carters reached their row, finding their wide leather seats, but as they settled, Jasmine noticed Karen moving with deliberate attention, offering drinks to the white passengers across the aisle, bending to make sure one elderly woman was comfortable, chatting about destinations. When she reached the Carters' row, her stride never slowed. She moved on as if their presence was invisible. Jasmine's lips parted, ready to speak, but Malcolm rested a hand gently on hers. His expression remained unreadable, but the message was clear. Watch, document, remember. Jasmine's throat burned with quiet indignation. She drew Zara close, whispering, "We'll be all right, sunshine." The engines hummed faintly as passengers continued filing in. The air in first class thickened with unspoken awareness. Some passengers glanced at the Carters, then quickly looked away. Others whispered behind hands, as though their very presence was a topic worth discussion. And through it all, Karen's eyes lingered, not with curiosity, but with disdain so sharp Jasmine could feel it slice. What the Carters did not know yet was that this disdain would not remain subtle. It would sharpen, escalate, and eventually break past every line of decency. What began as a stare at the gate was about to ignite into something far more dangerous. Something that would leave an entire cabin in stunned silence at 30,000 feet. The cabin smelled faintly of leather and citrus polish, its quiet hum designed to lull travelers into comfort. But for the Carters, comfort was already slipping away. Jasmine settled into her wide seat, cradling Zara against her chest. The space should have felt like a luxury. Extra legroom, seats angled for privacy, flight attendants trained to anticipate needs. Instead, it felt like sitting under a spotlight that refused to dim. Across the aisle, Karen Sutton's voice rang bright as she leaned toward an elderly white couple. "Would you like champagne before takeoff? Or perhaps orange juice?" She placed linen napkins on their trays with delicate precision, her smile as polished as the crystal glasses she carried. Then she turned, gliding past the Carters without even slowing. Jasmine's lips parted, startled. She glanced at Malcolm, who lifted a brow but said nothing. His calm expression held the same restraint he had carried at the counter, at security, at every hurdle so far. But his hand slid into his jacket pocket, fingers brushing the phone he kept there. A few rows up, another attendant stopped at a young white mother traveling with a toddler. The child whined loudly, throwing a small toy on the floor. Within moments, the attendant crouched, picked up the toy, and spoke in soothing tones. "Traveling can be tough on little ones. Would he like some crackers? Maybe apple juice?" The toddler's fuss softened as the mother gratefully accepted. Jasmine watched, heat rising in her chest. She knew exactly what that kind of compassion felt like. She gave it daily to children who weren't hers, children who needed gentleness. But today, her own daughter was invisible. Malcolm leaned slightly toward her, voice low but steady. "Just observe. Every detail." Her fingers curled tighter around Zara's blanket. She breathed slowly, eyes flicking toward Karen as the attendant continued down the aisle, serving everyone else as though the Carters' row simply did not exist. When the last tray was placed and Karen passed their row again, Malcolm spoke up. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried the authority of a man who expected acknowledgement. "We were skipped." Karen's face remained neutral. "I'll circle back," she said flatly, without pausing. She never did. The overhead lights dimmed slightly as the cabin crew prepared for departure. Jasmine pressed the call button, her thumb firm against the plastic. She waited. 5 minutes passed. No one came. She pressed it again. Still nothing. Finally, a young attendant approached. Troy Bennett, his name tag catching the glow of the aisle light. His tone was professional, but his eyes held an unspoken understanding. "How can I assist you today?" Relief touched Jasmine's voice. "I just needed some warm water for my daughter's formula." The call button didn't seem to bring anyone. "I'll handle it right away," he said with a nod, offering a reassuring smile at Zara before walking swiftly to the galley. Seconds later, Karen appeared, her expression stiff. "Bennett, economy passengers are waiting for service. Why are you delayed?" He didn't flinch. "I was assisting with an infant's formula request, returning to duty now." Karen's gaze swept over Jasmine and Malcolm, cold and unwavering, before she pivoted away. Jasmine's stomach churned. Her cheeks burned as she noticed nearby passengers watching. Some with sympathy, others with smirks or indifference. She hated that she felt embarrassed when in truth she had done nothing wrong. Humiliation isn't always loud, she thought bitterly. Sometimes it's the silence that cuts deepest. Malcolm shifted slightly, sliding his phone discreetly against his thigh. The red recording light reflected faintly before he dimmed the screen. Documentation had begun. The safety demonstration began, a monotone voice reciting instructions. Jasmine tried to focus on the words, but her heart thudded harder with every sideways glance, every whisper from across the aisle. She pulled Zara closer, humming under her breath as though the song could shield them both. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Jasmine's eyes closed for a moment. She prayed Zara would stay calm, that this flight would end without more pain. But wishes rarely survive altitude. The engines roared, the cabin tilted back, and pressure gripped the air. Zara's tiny face scrunched, her mouth opening in a sharp cry. At first, Jasmine rocked her gently, whispering against her hair. "Shh, sunshine, it's okay." She offered a pacifier, rubbed her daughter's ears, every trick she knew as both mother and pediatrician. The cries only grew louder, bouncing off the polished walls of first class. Across the aisle, heads began to turn. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably, others rolled their eyes. And at the far end of the cabin, Karen's gaze landed on them, heavy and unblinking. Zara wailed again, her voice piercing through the muffled thrum of the engines. Jasmine's chest tightened. Every attempt she made to soothe was swallowed by the baby's mounting distress. Malcolm reached for her hand, steadying her trembling fingers. His jaw set, but his voice was calm. "We'll handle it. Don't let them see you falter." But Jasmine already felt the weight of judgment pressing in from every direction. And as Karen began making her way slowly up the aisle, her eyes fixed on their row, Jasmine's heart sank. Because this wasn't just annoyance anymore, it was disdain sharpening into action. And what began with a skipped drink and an ignored call button was about to erupt into a confrontation that no one on board could ignore. The cabin rose into the clouds, but Jasmine's world narrowed to the weight of her baby in her arms. Zara's cries grew sharper, the kind that cut through even the insulated calm of first class. Her tiny fists balled up, her cheeks flushed deep, and her body stiffened against her mother's chest. Jasmine rocked her gently, whispering the same soothing words she had whispered to countless children in her clinic. She tried the pacifier, rubbed at Zara's ears to ease the pressure, shifted her into different positions. Nothing worked. The crying grew louder, the sound bouncing against polished walls and drawing glances from every direction. She felt the heat of those stares. Some were curious, some annoyed, and a few brimmed with irritation so unfiltered it made her stomach twist. From 3 rows up, Karen Sutton turned her head. Her eyes narrowed, her jaw set. She stood straighter, her posture radiating disapproval. It wasn't the look of an attendant trained to support passengers. It was the look of someone who had already decided who was at fault. Malcolm leaned slightly toward Jasmine, his voice steady, low. "She's just adjusting to the altitude. Keep doing what you're doing." But Jasmine's heart was pounding. She had faced restless nights, emergency room calls, babies who screamed until dawn. Yet here, inside this cabin, the cries didn't just echo, they branded her as a spectacle. The PA system crackled suddenly. Karen's voice, smooth but firm, filled the air. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to remind all passengers that maintaining a peaceful environment is essential for everyone's comfort. If you're experiencing any issues that might disturb others, please use the call button to request assistance." The words were general, yet every passenger knew exactly who they were aimed at. Dozens of heads turned toward Jasmine. Some shook their heads. Others smirked knowingly. Jasmine's throat tightened. She wanted to disappear into the seat, but instead she curled her body protectively around Zara. The humiliation stung sharper than the crying. It wasn't just her baby's noise being called out. It was her motherhood, her presence, her very right to be in that seat. Across the aisle, a white mother struggled with her restless toddler. Within minutes, a flight attendant appeared with a soft smile and a tray. "Here, sweetheart, some apple juice, maybe this will help." Crackers followed along with gentle conversation. The other mother laughed nervously, grateful for the kindness. The contrast was undeniable. One family was met with empathy, the other with public reprimand. Jasmine pressed her lips together, rocking Zara harder now, tears pressing at the corners of her eyes. "Why us? Why, always us," she thought bitterly. Her baby's cries built higher, each note piercing. The disapproving sigh of a businessman 2 rows ahead cut through the sound. He turned deliberately, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Some people shouldn't travel with infants if they can't control them. Before Jasmine could speak, Malcolm answered smoothly, his tone pleasant but edged with iron. And some people shouldn't speak unless they have something worth saying. The man turned back around, face flushed. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably, others smirked as if enjoying the show. Phones tilted at angles, capturing pieces of the scene. Jasmine's cheeks burned hotter. She had never felt so exposed, so raw, so shamed by the judgment of strangers. Exhaustion pressed down on her shoulders. She whispered to Zara, voice trembling, "It's okay, sunshine, mommy's here." But inside, her spirit wavered. She pressed the call button, a small hope, maybe help would come this time. Minutes passed, no one arrived. She pressed it again. Still nothing. Zara screamed louder, her tiny body rigid with need. Jasmine's pulse raced. She pressed the button a 3rd time, her thumb firm, desperate. This time, footsteps approached. But it wasn't the quiet, understanding presence of Troy Bennett. It wasn't help at all. It was Karen Sutton. Her heels clicked sharply against the aisle floor as she advanced, eyes locked on Jasmine with something colder than irritation. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her expression unreadable but charged. Passengers leaned in, some raising phones, others whispering to each other. Jasmine's stomach dropped. Because the look in Karen's eyes wasn't one of assistance. It was confrontation. And as she stopped beside their row, towering over Jasmine and the wailing baby, her disdain carried the weight of something unthinkable yet to come. Karen stood at the Carter's row, her shadow stretching across Jasmine and the crying baby. Her voice, when it came, was low but sharp enough to carry. "Ma'am, your child is disturbing the entire cabin. You need to get her under control." The words weren't framed as compassion or guidance. They weren't even neutral. They were laced with accusation, spoken loudly enough for the nearest passengers to hear, ensuring the humiliation settled squarely on Jasmine's shoulders. Jasmine blinked, her mouth parting in shock. "She's an infant," she whispered, rocking Zara harder. "She's in pain from the altitude. I'm doing everything I can." Karen's lips tightened. "Then perhaps you should have considered whether bringing a baby into 1st class was appropriate." Gasps rippled from nearby rows. Some passengers ducked their heads, pretending not to have heard. Others exchanged glances that confirmed the undertone. The disbelief that someone like Jasmine had taken a seat meant for privilege. Malcolm straightened in his seat, his voice controlled but unmistakably firm. "That comment was unnecessary. My wife has every right to be here with our daughter." Karen didn't even look at him. She adjusted her uniform, posture rigid, and glanced pointedly at the carry-on bags overhead. "For safety reasons, your belongings will need to be relocated. All items must be stowed properly during meal service." Jasmine frowned. "They already are." Ignoring her, Karen reached up and tugged their bags from the overhead bin, her movements jerky and deliberate. She carried them several rows back, shoving them into another compartment. Malcolm's laptop bag and Jasmine's purse, the items they had tucked neatly beneath their seats, were also pulled away, placed into the seatback pockets in front of them without explanation. Passengers watched in silence, some wide-eyed, some smirking as if entertained. Not one voice rose to question the act. Jasmine felt her face burn, shame and fury twisting together. She wanted to stand, to shout, but Zara's cries forced her to stay seated, rocking, whispering, clinging to calm that was slipping away. Malcolm's hand closed over hers. His tone was even, but his eyes gleamed. "Stay steady. Let her dig her own hole." Karen turned back, her chin lifted, her smile brittle. "It's policy," she said coldly. Her words meant more for the audience of watching passengers than for the Carters. From behind, a low voice whispered, "That's not actually policy." It was Troy Bennett, leaning slightly forward, his tone just loud enough for the Carters to hear. His expression remained professional, but his eyes betrayed unease. Malcolm gave the faintest nod in acknowledgement, but Karen's gaze snapped toward Troy, her eyes narrowing. He immediately sat back, his silence forced. The Carters were alone again, under the full weight of Karen's disdain. Zara's cries softened for a moment, replaced by a hiccuping whimper, but the reprieve was brief. Her small body stiffened once more, her face scrunching as the wail returned. Jasmine pressed the call button, her thumb firm. Seconds passed. Nothing. Karen's eyes flicked down at the glowing light above their seats, but she didn't move. She continued down the aisle, serving drinks, smiling warmly at white passengers, joking lightly with a businessman who had rolled his eyes earlier. The contrast wasn't lost on anyone. The whispers grew louder, threading through the cabin like smoke. Some people just can't handle first class. Why would they bring a baby here? It's disruptive. But woven into those whispers was another truth. An undercurrent no one said aloud. The comments weren't just about a crying baby. They were about who was holding her. Jasmine heard it in every hushed voice, saw it in every sidelong glance. She clutched Zara tighter, whispering against her daughter's soft hair, "You belong here. Don't you ever think otherwise?" Malcolm leaned slightly toward his wife, his phone now balanced subtly on his thigh. The screen glowed faintly, recording everything. His voice was calm, but his jaw worked as he whispered, "Let her keep talking. Every word is proof." When Karen finally returned, her smile had vanished completely. She loomed over Jasmine, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Ma'am," she said, her tone clipped, "this cannot continue. You need to comply with my instructions, or you'll face consequences." Jasmine froze. Comply with what? Feeding my child, holding her, comforting her? Karen leaned closer, her eyes locking on Jasmine's. The disdain in her voice was unmistakable, sharp enough to slice through the murmurs of the watching crowd. Comply. She repeated, her lips curling faintly. Or face consequences. The aisle seemed to shrink as Karen loomed closer, her words still hanging heavy in the air. Comply or face consequences. Jasmine's arms tightened protectively around Zara. The baby's cries pierced the cabin, raw and desperate. Jasmine whispered, her voice trembling but firm, "She's hungry. I'm her mother. I will not stop caring for her." Karen's face flushed, a storm breaking across her features. Passengers shifted, some raising their phones higher, others leaning forward, eager to see where the confrontation would lead. The hum of the engines seemed to fade, replaced by a charged silence. Jasmine tried again to prepare the bottle, her hands shaking as she measured the powder. Zara's cries had turned to a frantic wail, her tiny legs kicking against her mother's chest. "Enough," Karen snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. She reached forward suddenly, her hand brushing too close to Zara's arm. Jasmine recoiled instantly, her entire body twisting to shield the baby. Her heart slammed against her ribs. "Don't touch her." But Karen's composure was gone, stripped away by disdain and anger. Her lips curled. "You're being hysterical. You're disrupting this cabin." And then it happened. Her hand swung out in a wide, furious arc. The slap cracked through the air, echoing so loudly it seemed to stop time. Jasmine's head snapped to the side under the force, her cheek instantly stinging, her grip on Zara tightening in terror. For a heartbeat, she nearly lost hold of her baby. The cabin froze. Phones rose in unison, mouths opened in shock. The silence was absolute, broken only by Zara's scream, louder, shriller, as though she felt every ounce of her mother's pain. Jasmine's eyes blurred with tears, her cheek burning red. She clutched Zara tighter, gasping for breath, her body trembling. Her mind scrambled to make sense of what had just happened. But the truth was undeniable. In front of a plane full of witnesses, she had been assaulted while holding her child. Karen stood rigid, her chest heaving, as if she realized too late what she'd done, but refused to back down. Her voice, when it came, was cold and deliberate. "You were out of control. It was necessary." The passengers' collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Necessary? To strike a mother with her infant in her arms? One woman near the front covered her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. A businessman who had rolled his eyes earlier now sat frozen, his phone recording steadily. The elderly couple across the aisle shook their heads in horror. And still, Karen refused to retreat. Her chin lifted, her tone icy, as though she believed authority alone could shield her. "I was enforcing protocol." Jasmine's throat closed around her words. Her dignity, her safety, her humanity, all stripped in a single moment. She rocked Zara against her chest, sobbing quietly, whispering to her baby, "I've got you, sunshine, I've got you." But the cabin no longer looked at Jasmine with annoyance. They looked at Karen, eyes narrowed, some filled with anger, others with disbelief. The line between indifference and outrage had been crossed. For 3 heartbeats, no one moved. Then a single sound broke the silence. The click of a phone camera. Then another. Then another. The passengers had become witnesses, evidence gathering in dozens of hands. Karen's eyes darted, the first flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. She straightened her jacket, attempting to restore composure, but the damage was irreversible. And then, slowly, deliberately, Malcolm rose from his seat. The man who had sat calmly through every indignity, who had told his wife to hold steady, who had swallowed his fury for hours, was no longer calm. His movements were measured, but his presence filled the cabin like a storm about to break. His eyes locked on Karen, unblinking, his jaw tight, his shoulders squared. The passengers held their breath, because in that moment, every person in the cabin knew the calm was gone. Controlled fury had taken its place. The silence after the slap still lingered, a silence so heavy it pressed against the walls of the cabin. Passengers stared wide-eyed, phones raised, mouths slightly open. Jasmine sat frozen, her cheek blazing red, her baby crying uncontrollably in her arms. Malcolm stood in the aisle, towering over Karen Sutton, his eyes locked on her with the quiet ferocity of a man whose patience had just been ripped away. For hours, he had tolerated the snide looks, the dismissive gestures, the public humiliation of his wife and child. But this was the line no one should have dared to cross. Karen shifted under his gaze, her authority suddenly brittle. Still, she forced her voice to stay steady. "Sir, you need to sit down. This isn't..." Malcolm cut her off, his tone calm but ringing with a weight that silenced the entire cabin. "Do you have any idea who you just put your hands on? Do you even know who you're speaking to right now?" The murmurs started. Passengers leaned closer, phones steady in their hands. A few exchanged looks, their whispers darting through the cabin like sparks catching dry grass. Karen blinked, confusion briefly flashing in her eyes before she masked it with condescension. "You're a passenger, sir, and you'll need to." Malcolm's voice sharpened, slicing through her sentence. "No, I am not just a passenger. I am Malcolm Carter. I own this airline." The words hit like thunder, gasps erupted. A businessman choked on his drink. The elderly couple's eyes widened in disbelief. Phones shot higher, recording every angle. Whispers rippled through the cabin, rising into a storm of shocked chatter. Karen's face drained of color. The flush that had fueled her righteous anger moments ago vanished, leaving her pale and hollow. She stepped back instinctively, as if retreating could undo what she had just done. Naomi's voice, soft and deliberate, carried the weight of the moment. The color drained from her face as if she realized she'd slapped her own paycheck. Karen's lips parted, but no words came. She had spent the entire flight wielding power, confident in her ability to diminish and control. Now, the balance had shattered. The man standing before her wasn't just another black passenger she could belittle and dismiss. He was the man who signed the contracts that kept her uniform on her back. Malcolm didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His authority filled the cabin, commanding every ear. "You humiliated my wife. You ignored her calls for help. You singled her out again and again for no reason other than the color of her skin." And then, he paused, his eyes narrowing, his voice tightening with fury. "You put your hands on her while she was holding our child." Every word landed like a strike. The passengers sat frozen, captivated, many nodding unconsciously as if agreeing aloud would break the spell. Karen opened her mouth, desperate for control. "I was only enforcing policy." A voice interrupted her, Troy Bennett, the other flight attendant, stepping forward with urgency. His expression was grim, his voice steady but firm. "That was not policy. That was abuse, and I won't let it continue." He moved closer to Jasmine, gently crouching to her level. "Dr. Carter, are you all right? Do you need anything for Zara?" His tone was the opposite of Karen's, soft, respectful, protective. Jasmine blinked through her tears, nodding shakily. The kindness almost broke her, a stark contrast to the cruelty she had endured. Karen's mouth snapped shut. The dynamic had flipped entirely. The passengers murmured openly now, voices rising with indignation. "Unbelievable," one whispered. "She hit her." Another hissed. "On camera, she's finished," muttered a man holding his phone steady. Karen's hands fidgeted at her sides, her jaw tightening as she realized every passenger had become both witness and judge. Malcolm leaned slightly forward, his gaze unrelenting. "This will not be buried. It will not be excused. And let me make something very clear. He straightened, his shoulders squared, his voice low but resonant. This will not end when the plane lands. The words hung in the air, heavier than the slap, heavier than the silence that followed it. Passengers exchanged wide-eyed glances, aware they were part of a moment far larger than a single flight. Phones kept rolling, capturing history in real time. Jasmine clutched Zara tightly, her tears mingling with a flicker of hope. And Karen Sutton, once so confident, so dismissive, stood trembling facing the man whose wrath had only just begun. Karen's breath came shallow, her posture stiff as if standing upright could still salvage the authority she had already lost. Her lips moved quickly, her tone sharp but faltering. I was enforcing safety protocol. The mother was, uncooperative. I did what I needed to ensure order in this cabin. The words rang hollow, echoing across a sea of disbelieving stares. Every passenger had seen what happened. Every phone camera had caught the moment her hand struck. Her excuses were airless, collapsing before they even left her mouth. From the third row, a man's voice cut through the hum. That wasn't protocol, that was assault. A woman beside him added, she was holding her baby. We all saw it, every one of us. The ripple spread, passengers emboldened now that Malcolm had spoken. For hours they had been silent witnesses, some complicit in their silence. Now they spoke. Their voices rose in fragments, overlapping, each one confirming the truth. Karen's face twitched, her eyes darting desperately. You don't understand. If passengers don't comply, flights become dangerous. It's my responsibility too. Malcolm's voice cut her down, calm but thunderous in its certainty. Your responsibility is safety. Yes, but safety does not include slapping a mother across the face while she protects her child. Phones in the cabin caught every syllable. The red lights of cameras glowed like dozens of tiny eyes, unblinking, unrelenting. Naomi's voice threaded through the moment. Injustice doesn't survive long when witnessed by the many. Karen's uniform, once a shield, now seemed like a costume, flimsy, incapable of covering what had been revealed. She took a step back, the tremor in her hand betraying her. Troy Bennett returned, carrying a small ice pack. He knelt gently by Jasmine's side, offering it with care. For the swelling, ma'am. His voice was soft, protective, his glance at Karen sharp with restrained anger. Jasmine accepted, pressing the cool pack against her reddened cheek while rocking Zara against her chest. Her baby's sobs had softened to hiccups, but the child's eyes were wide, unsettled, as though she too had absorbed the weight of the violence. Passengers whispered, the hum of their outrage threading like current through the cabin. A few whispered about lawsuits, others about news outlets. Someone muttered, "This is going viral tonight." Karen turned sharply toward the galley, her voice trembling as she pressed the intercom button. "Captain, we may have a situation in the first-class cabin." A pause. Then the captain's voice, calm but clipped. "Clarify, Sutton." She swallowed hard. A disruptive passenger, possible threat to order. Gasps rose immediately. A businessman scoffed aloud. "She's lying through her teeth. That man hasn't raised his voice once." Another voice, female, sharper. "He's the owner. He's the reason this plane exists, and she just slapped his wife." The murmurs swelled louder, spreading like a wave. The captain's tone returned, firmer now. "I'm coming out." Karen stiffened, panic flickering across her face. She hadn't expected her own chain of command to unravel so quickly. She turned back to Malcolm, her voice a strained whisper, meant only for him. "You don't have to ruin me. We can handle this privately." Malcolm's eyes hardened. "You ruined yourself the moment your hand struck my wife." The weight of his words settled like stone. Karen staggered slightly, as if they had pushed her back, without him moving an inch. Whispers ran through the rows again. "Divert the plane?" one man asked. "Maybe. They might land early just for this." "Good. Let her answer for it." The hum of the engines carried on, indifferent, while inside the cabin humanity had split in two, dignity on one side, disgrace on the other. Karen shifted again, mumbling to herself, almost pleading. I was just doing my job." But her job had been stripped bare, exposed as prejudice cloaked in authority, and everyone saw it. Malcolm stood steady, his arm brushing lightly against Jasmine's shoulder, as if anchoring her. "This will not be forgotten," he said evenly, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "Not by me, not by my family, and certainly not by this airline." Passengers nodded. Phones kept recording. Evidence layered upon evidence. Karen's face, once stiff with superiority, now looked like plaster cracking under pressure. Her hands fidgeted at her sides, her gaze darting to every phone that captured her collapse. And as the cabin descended into a tense hush, Naomi's voice drew the moment tight, like pulling a thread until it snapped. The sky still held them miles above ground, but the reckoning was already waiting on the runway. The descent began in uneasy silence. Seatbelts clicked, trays locked, the ritual of landing carried out with stiff mechanical motions. But the air in the cabin wasn't routine. It pulsed with something heavier. Everyone knew they were arriving not at the end of a flight, but at the edge of consequence. Jasmine held Zara close, whispering softly into her baby's curls. Her cheeks still burned, though the ice pack had dulled the swelling. Malcolm sat beside her, steady as stone, his hand resting lightly on hers. His stillness wasn't calm. It was the quiet of a man bracing for impact of a different kind. Phones were still out. Passengers murmured in hushed tones, speculating, replaying the moment of the slap in their heads. Some replaying it on their screens. The footage had already begun circulating through the aircraft's Wi-Fi, climbing into online feeds before the wheels even touched the ground. The incident had outgrown the cabin. Naomi's voice cut through the tension. Cameras caught everything. Not just passengers, but the security feed. The truth wasn't locked in memory. It was recorded in high definition, impossible to bury. The plane touched down with a jolt. Engines roared, wheels screeched, and the cabin lurched forward. A collective exhale followed, but it wasn't relief. It was anticipation. Through the small windows, flashing lights lined the tarmac. Police cruisers idled beside the terminal. 2 black SUVs with tinted windows waited near the jet bridge. Uniformed officers stood in formation. Airline officials clustered together, their faces grim, clipped voices speaking into radios. Karen's face paled further with every passing second. She twisted the hem of her uniform, her hands trembling. The superiority she had once wielded had drained away entirely, replaced by a desperation that clung to her like sweat. The captain's voice came over the intercom, his tone heavier than the standard landing announcements. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. Law enforcement will be boarding the aircraft momentarily." The cabin erupted in whispers. "They're here for her. She's finished. Unbelievable." Karen glanced around wildly, eyes darting to passengers who avoided her gaze. Once, she had commanded silence with her authority. Now, every face looked at her with condemnation, or worse, with pity. The jet bridge connected with a metallic thud. The door opened, and uniformed officers stepped inside, followed by airline executives in tailored suits. Cameras flashed outside, the frenzy of media waiting just beyond the glass. An officer spoke firmly. Karen Sutton stepped forward. Karen's knees buckled slightly. "Please, this is a misunderstanding. I was only..." "Step forward." The officer's tone left no room for argument. Passengers recorded openly, their phones raised without shame. Every second was being documented, every plea, every tear. Karen stumbled into the aisle, her hands lifted slightly as if surrendering to the inevitable. Tears streaked her face, her words dissolving into broken protests. I was just following rules." But the sound of handcuffs clicking shut drowned her out. Naomi's voice sharpened with the weight of history. The same rules she had hidden behind all flight long had crumbled the moment they were tested under truth. As Karen was escorted off the plane, her sobs echoing faintly, Jasmine closed her eyes. She kissed Zara's head, her arms trembling with both exhaustion and fragile relief. Malcolm didn't move until he was certain his wife and child were secure. Only then did he rise, his presence commanding the aisle. Airline officials approached, their words tumbling over each other. Apologies, explanations, promises. He silenced them with a raised hand. "Not now," he said simply, his voice like steel. "My family comes first." Escorted by Troy, who walked protectively ahead, the Carters were guided off the plane. Flashbulbs exploded outside, journalists shouting questions. "Mr. Carter, is it true you own the airline? What actions will you take against your staff? Mrs. Carter, how are you and your baby doing?" Malcolm shielded Jasmine and Zara with his body, moving steadily through the chaos. His silence wasn't weakness, it was power. Every step reminded the crowd that the story wasn't ending here. Because this wasn't just about one slap, one flight, one attendant. This was about an entire system. and Naomi's voice sealed the moment. But this was only the beginning. Malcolm wasn't done. The world outside the airport moved fast. Headlines spun within hours, videos reached millions, and voices across the globe weighed in on what had happened 30,000 feet above the ground. But for Jasmine Carter, the memory wasn't headlines. It was the heat of a slap across her cheek, the terrified wail of her baby, and the eyes of strangers watching her dignity tested. Malcolm Carter stood before cameras the next morning, not as a silent witness, but as the owner of the airline. His voice carried the same calm steadiness he had held in the cabin, but now it was sharpened with purpose. "No mother," he said firmly, "should ever face humiliation while cradling her child. What happened on that flight is not just unacceptable, it is a violation of humanity itself." He announced sweeping reforms: mandatory anti-discrimination training for every staff member, immediate suspension of employees caught in bias-based misconduct, and the creation of an independent oversight board to handle passenger complaints with transparency. Policies would no longer be words buried in manuals, they would be standards lived out in the aisles of every flight. Naomi's voice guided the reflection. Hate reveals itself in moments of power imbalance, but justice can reveal itself just as quickly. One hand struck in arrogance, another stood in resistance, and the difference between the two will shape what the skies look like tomorrow. Jasmine's image, rocking Zara with quiet resilience even in the face of cruelty, spread farther than the story of the attendant's collapse. Passengers remembered her strength, her refusal to hand over her child, her insistence on dignity even while her cheeks burned red. The footage didn't just expose discrimination, it exposed courage. And yet Naomi's voice deepened, drawing the audience closer. The Carters had power, influence, wealth. But ask yourself, what if it had been someone else? What if it had been you, or your daughter, or a mother without cameras watching? The question hung heavy, demanding reflection, not passivity. Would you have spoken up if you were on that plane? Passengers had eventually raised their voices, yes, but not before silence had allowed injustice to grow unchecked for hours. The truth was clear. Too many still hesitate to act until cruelty becomes undeniable. The audience is brought into the moment now, not as watchers of a story, but as participants in a choice. Have you ever witnessed injustice while traveling? Did you stay silent, or did you step in? The call for courage became personal. If you believe no mother should ever face humiliation in the skies, like and subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ. Share your story in the comments and tell us the country you're watching from. Because these stories don't end when the plane lands. They end when people everywhere decide enough is enough. Naomi's closing line fell like a verdict. One slap tried to silence a mother, but her child's cry, and the voices that rose to defend her, will echo far longer than hate ever could.